Hi, this is Tommy Frank with Frank Arts. Thanks for checking out this workshop video by Stephen Hill. Stephen Hill is a treasure in Kansas City as far as someone who can make amazing pots. He's an incredible instructor, and I know that you're going to see that in this workshop. So thanks for checking out the Advanced Spraying Glaze workshop that has atmospheric effects in the electric firing. Stephen's been doing this for quite some time. He kind of talks about his shift from cone 10 to electric, right around cone 8. He shows some of the advanced techniques that he uses for spraying glaze, but he also talks a lot about the equipment. He talks about some of the different layerings that he does, and he kind of specifies those inside of the workshop. So there's some really great information. The handout's really fantastic. We hope that you enjoyed a lot. So thanks very much, and take it away, Stephen.
Well, thank you, Tommy. I really appreciate being part of your workshop series, and I'm looking forward to today. And today we're going to take a little more advanced look at spraying glazes. I kind of attempted to bring everybody up to speed on the first workshop 2 weeks ago, and if you feel like you need a little preliminary information to add on to this, that's still available as a recording from Frank Arts. So you can still access that if you didn't pay for it in the first place. So anyway, today what I want to talk about is kind of my personal system of it's something that over the course of 20, 30 years, I developed in a totally intuitive manner. I started out with very simple spraying and using spraying as a highlight to glazes that were dipped and poured. But gradually things got more complex over the years, and it got to the point where I was spraying everything, and it was 100% intuition. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a system figured out. It was just baby steps, learning every time from the experience of the time before. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about my influences, what I wanted to capture on my pots, and I think probably the most important thing is that when I glaze my pots, what I'm looking for is kind of one rich and varied surface. I don't want a pot to look like I have 5 to 7 glazes sprayed on it. I want a pot to look like it was something that was exposed to some sort of a natural force, something altered by the force of nature. So my first influence on this was an early experience I had with salt firing, and once I had this experience with salt firing in the early 70s, I was very intrigued by the fact that the pots were not glazed in a symmetrical fashion. They tended to be a little juicier on one side, a little drier on the other side. And so my earliest influence was kind of being influenced by what I saw on wood-fired pots and on salt and soda-fired pots. And it's that action of the ash or the soda in the atmosphere and the way it related to the form of the pots. And then once I kind of started getting a toehold in the way I was spraying glazes, I started looking kind of outside of my direct influence from pottery. And one of the first things that influenced me were cypress swamps in the southeastern part of the United States. The shape of the cypress trees, the mirror lake that they often grew out of, and the Spanish moss that was hanging in the trees, I found a mystery in this, and it was something that I kind of early on tried to start emulating with my glazes. And then in general, it kind of went to the act of weathering in the natural world, and I would look at rocks and wood that had been exposed to weathering, and I just discovered that I really enjoyed the way moss and lichens grow on tree trunks and on rocks, and every time I was in a part of the natural world that had that, it just attracted to me like glue. It just like pulled me in, and I started thinking that this is the quality I wanted the surface of my pots to have. Also, have had a little bit of chance to see the isolated ecosystem of tidal pools in the Pacific Northwest, which tend to look a lot like crystals growing in shiny glazes, and all this stuff kind of just filtered through my experience, and it gave me a direction and ideas for what I wanted to develop in the way of glazes. Now, spraying, it turns out, was a very natural way for me to apply glazes. It was a way where I could put a lot of contrasting glazes on pots and layers to develop this kind of ecosystem I was looking for. But spraying's not the only way to do this. It can be done with brushing. It can be done with dipping. It can be done with stamping glazes. You can use a sponge and kind of stamp the layers of glaze on. But one of the unique abilities of spraying is its ability to introduce micro layers. Everybody knows that if you spend time trying to double dip and triple dip pots, that it's very easy to get the glaze on too thick. And that's never been my goal. I want kind of a standard glaze thickness, but I want a lot of activity within that. And the micro layers that are available in spraying was a really natural fit. So as I said, all of this influence that I took from the natural world, from moss and lichens and Spanish moss and tidal pools and so forth, all found its way into my pottery in a very intuitive way. But when I started trying to teach the techniques that I had learned in glazing, one of the things I realized right away is that you can't really teach intuition. You know, intuition is really something that comes through experience. And so I started looking for ways to teach what I did that was outside of my intuition experience. And with that, I came upon what essentially is a formula of glaze application. So let's just use this pot for an example here. One of the things I've got is the surface area of the pot, and that can be 0 to 100%. And so that accounts for where on the pot the glaze is. And the second percentage is the thickness of the glaze where it's applied. And that can also be 0 to 100%. So I'll have a percentage of coverage and a percentage of glaze thickness. And I'm going to talk about my system and how I figured out how to teach the way I glaze pots. And there's going to be some percentages. It's going to sound like math and pie charts and that sort of thing, but underneath it all is my intuitional experience over many years of kind of developing my style of glazing. So specifically, my system of when I'm teaching my system of using multiple glazes, I I have divided glazes up into 5 different categories. The categories are liners, a base, modifiers, ash glazes, and borders. And what I want to do is to kind of talk about how I use each one of those categories on pots, and how I can make it make sense to somebody else. So liners are pretty straightforward. It's a liner. Liner is an interior glaze on a pot that has a closed off interior space. An open bowl, in my mind, does not have a liner glaze. So all of my liner glazes are poured out, and then any spills wiped off as I'm glazing. My liner glazes, they tend to be 100% of the interior of the pot, and they tend to be 95 to 100% of the total thickness where I'm using them. Sometimes I will spray contrasting glaze down inside just to give a little bit of a transition, but mostly the liner glazes are poured and solo. And I have 3 glazes that I use as liners. I have frost black, which is the one I just showed you, red orange, which is the interior of this pot, and satin white, which I don't have on any pots here because I tend not to use white liners that much on my work. But I do use it, and you have the formulas for it. So the first category is very straightforward, and it pretty much translates into what everybody has learned to do when dipping and pouring glazes. A second category is the base, and the base, in many ways, it plays a dominant role in all of the stuff I'm going to talk about. But the base is never something that I use as a solo glaze. It's always part of the surface thickness, but never 100%. I have 2 glazes that I use as a base. One is Strontium Crystal Magic Warm. The other is Strontium Crystal Magic Cool. And something I'll be showing you in a little bit, not quite yet, is the range of colors that I use that has examples of what I consider my cool palette and warm palette. But I only use two bases, and it's SCM Warm, SCM Cool. The purpose of the base glaze is the main purpose is it's a crystal former. I use a lot of microcrystalline glazes, and Strontium Crystal Magic gives me the ability to grow crystals, but it's actually a little too good at that. It grows so many crystals by itself that they tend to grow together, and so they're not as distinct looking. So the way I use Strontium Crystal Magic, I never want it 100% of the glaze. I want it to have modifiers over the top, which helps bring out the color development. Using a base over a good portion of my pots also promotes cohesion on my surfaces. If I use the modifiers without the base underneath them, it tends to look like different glazes sprayed in ways that are way too obvious. With the base underneath, it tends to soften the look, and it makes it more cohesive from one part of the pot to the next part of the pot. So on the base glaze, I tend to use them 60 to 100% of the surface area of the pot. So it can be the entire outside, or something less than the entire outside, depending on the form I'm putting them on. And in terms of total thickness, 60 to 80% of total thickness. So the base is the majority of surface area, and it's also the majority of total thickness. But everything that I spray over the base is equally important for how the pots look in the final color development and surface development. So the modifiers, which the main goal of my use of modifiers is to transform the base, to take the color, or to take the general substance of the base and make it into something that is responsible for the unique colors on my pots. I'm looking for something that's rich, colorful, and kind of atmospheric in quality. One of the things that the modifiers do is they tend to space out the microcrystals that are developing in the SCM and make them a little more visible. They make them look a little more spectacular. You can see on this bowl here, all the speckled quality, all the texture is due to the interaction of the modifiers with the SCM Cool. Modifiers to me can be either matte or glossy, transparent or opaque, but they tend to differentiate the different colors and textures that are on my finished work. So the modifiers, in terms of, they tend to go over the SCM warm or cool bases, and so it takes up the same, my brain doesn't work in these percentages very easy. It covers the same 60 to 100% of the surface of the pot, and they take up the remaining 20 to 40% of total thickness available. So the base is over half of the total thickness, and the modifiers, and I could have 3 or 4 modifiers in one spot, they take up a total of 20 to 40% of total thickness. The ash, which is something that people think of with my pottery quite a bit, the ash is accountable for the streaking that you see. And I want to talk a little bit about ash glazes. Ash glazes were originally made with wood ashes as an important ingredient. And in fact, all my early experimentations were true ash glazes. Sometime in the 70s, I realized that I could make glazes that behaved as ash glazes without wood ash, and it ended up being a predominance of calcium carbonate or whiting in my glaze that caused the glaze to first of all bead up and then start streaking, which is the typical quality that we've come to appreciate in ash glazes. And so once I discovered that, I stopped using ash and just started using calcium-rich glazes to form what have become known as fake ash glazes, although I despise the word fake, but it's better than faux. And one of my favorite ways of describing fake ash glazes is to call them ash-like, but the thing that I always come back to is fake ash glazes. So fake is a word that's not aging well these days. So anyway, the ash glaze can be used either as a solo glaze over the clay body, and when it's used as a solo glaze over the clay body, the runs tend to be more distinct. So you see these long distinct runs. That's where the ash was the thickest and where it kind of started out as a solo glaze. Where it looks more feathery, which you can see down here, that's when the ash glaze is used as a as a modifier over the SCM. So if the ash glaze is a modifier, it tends to be more subtle. If it's a solo glaze, it tends to be a little more distinct in the runs it creates. So for the ash, first of all, it can be 0 to 40% of the surface area on my pots. This pot, for instance, has no ash on it, so you don't see any streaking. I don't use ash on all my pots. I only use ash when I want the kind of typical streaky look. And this is something that was really highly influenced by Spanish moss and bald cypress trees, by the way. And where the ash is, in terms of total thickness, it can be anywhere from probably 20% of the total thickness up to 100%. Like I said, where it's feathery, it's a thinner coat of ash over the base. Where it's more distinct runs, it's a heavier application with starting out over bare clay.
Stephen, can I jump in with a couple questions?
Sure.
So someone was wondering what the modifiers are. Do you have that listed on the handout, or do you know that off the top of your head?
Modifiers. What do you mean by? No, I'm just kidding. It's in the handouts, and it's also something that I am going to be getting to in a little bit. So
that's great. Okay, awesome.
It's coming right up.
Awesome.
Okay. Did you have another question?
Another quick one. Someone was just wondering if there's an example of when or what type of piece would warrant an application of the base glaze at greater than 100% of the surface area. And maybe we'll talk about that.
It can't be greater than 100%.
That's a good point. Oh, maybe less than. Okay.
I do. I use a lot of times less. I think we're going to hold both those questions.
That sounds fun. Bit. Yeah, that's good. We'll get back to those. You bet. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the final category, number 5, is what I call borders, and I'm going to go back to this pot again. The border is really obvious on here. It's the black rim, the black handle, and the black line around the foot, which kind of frames the pot. It's kind of like a mat on a drawing. What I try to do with the border is to have it make all the organic stuff that happens in between kind of framed and tied together by the slightly more simple and straightforward border glaze. So you see the border is pretty obvious here. But I also use borders on pots that aren't quite so obvious. We'll take this on the picture. On the picture, I've got a plain surface here where the rim of the pot flattens out as it is thrown, and that gives me a spot for a border glaze. On this mug, for instance, there is no plane here to spray a border on. So when I think about a form like this, I think of the liner glaze as being the border on the top of the pot, because just about any time you look at the top of the pot, you're going to see into the pot. And then I go back and echo that with there's a little black glaze around the bottom of this. So I use that to kind of tie the top and the bottom of the pot together. And borders for me tend to be 0 to 10% of the surface area. So I don't ever see a border as being too thick on my pots. And pretty much 95 to 100% of the thickness. They always have a little bit of overspray over them, but mostly the borders are either the frost black, the red orange, or white. my pots, mostly the frost black or red orange. And so the glazes that I use for borders are the same 3 glazes that I use for this picture has red orange for a liner glaze and the frost black for a border, so it kind of separates those two. So as you could tell from my explanation, there are quite a bit of rules that I'm applying to my pottery. Some of the rules I think have a universal nature to them, and some of the rules are very personal. And I'm going to start by talking about the universal rules. Now, first of all, I want to say I think we all need to break rules, but I think we learn from breaking rules. We learn by doing things that somebody tells us not to do, and we somehow make that work for us. That's how growth often appears in our work. But in spite of that, I think one universal rules that everybody should apply to their experimentation is to keep accurate records. The only way we really learn from breaking rules is to keep records of what we're doing. If we don't keep records, every time we're like starting from the same point, and we're not really necessarily growing from our experiences. And you can keep notes any way that's comfortable for you. You can use paper. You can use your phone to take pictures of pieces. There's an app out there called Pottery Notes, which I have never personally used, but a lot of my students have used it, and I played around with it just enough to think that it's probably a pretty good idea if you're so inclined. And thing is, when you're spraying multiple glazes and having all these micro layers, it's impossible to ever glaze 2 pots exactly alike. And so you're not always going to be able to recognize what happens when it comes out of the kiln, because it might look different this time than last time, because you got different relationships of thicknesses when you're spraying glazes on. So that just emphasizes the need to keep notes of what you're doing. You get to a point where you're comfortable enough with this sort of system that you don't really have to make notes on everything, but I always make notes when I'm experimenting with new glazes, because I'm never sure what they're going to do. And don't ever fall into the trap of as you're glazing thinking, oh, I'll remember this. I certainly don't remember it myself. When I was younger, I always thought that, but it never worked out. Now that I'm older, it's definitely not. I'm definitely not in the category of remembering, but even though I still sometimes think I can. So also another, I think, universal rule about applying layers, spraying layers to pots, is to start a little bit on the simple side with 1 or 2 modifiers, and kind of work complexity up. So start with simple solutions, get more complex as you're seeing some positive results, and you kind of like the direction that it's going. And third universal rule is pay attention to the total thickness. When you're spraying layers, you can get carried away. You can put so much glaze on that you overload the surface, which can lead to running, can lead to crawling, can lead to all kinds of glaze defects, blistering. And so, and this is the most intuitive of all the processes. You really only understand how much you're spraying by the experience of doing it. You can't really, nobody can teach that. You have to get it firsthand through experimentation. But You know, if you have too little total thickness, you're going to end up with a glaze effect that looks more like a patina on your work rather than a total surface. But and then you get too much total thickness, and you can lead to running and crawling. This is one of the reasons that I don't really advise people to dip multiple layers on one pot, because it's way too easy to get too much thickness. Most of the pots that I make, they kind of like a generous thickness of glaze. I if I tend to compare to what I would be putting on a pot if I was dipping, I think of my pots as liking somewhere around 1 to 1.5 layers of thickness. And that's, again, it's an intuitive thing. It's not something that can be translated directly, but as you're glazing, if you like the kind of activity that I get on my pots, you want a generous coat, but not too generous. And then, okay, so those are three rules that I figure are kind of universal to everybody that wants to spray layers. The personal ones,
Can I jump in before we move to personal?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Someone was wondering, as far as like a rule of thumb on thickness, is that like 1/8 of an inch, or do you measure that, or do you, I mean, I know that you've kind of come to it through a lot of trial and error. Is there any way that you measure that nowadays, or could give a tip to anybody?
Yes, the best tip I can give is a very general concept of spray it until it's wet. And what happens is, when you're glazing a pot, when you're spraying it, if you have a spray gun that works efficiently, as the glaze and moisture hits the pot, it will start out looking dusty, and then it gets a little, eventually gets a little wet. So if you spray each glaze until it's wet, the first glaze goes on a little thicker, second glaze goes on a little thinner, third glaze thinner yet, because the pores start getting filled with water. And so that's a way to think about it. Another way is, if you think you're there but are not sure, you can kind of take a needle tool and kind of pick at the surface a little bit, and you can kind of see the thickness, and then kind of brush it over to get rid of the bare spot. But really, it's something that really has to come through intuition more than anything else.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Intuition and experience. So the first time you dip a pot, it's pretty easy to get the glaze on fairly evenly. The first time you spray a pot, not necessarily. You have to kind of work up to it. You have to expect a little bit of a learning curve to accompany you on that.
Okay, I've got lightning round questions. You ready? Quick answers.
Okay.
Okay. Since you raw glazed, do you allow them to air dry for a period of time before loading and firing?
No.
You just go straight into the kiln.
But I have a very slow preheat.
Okay. Let's see. Someone wants to know the fingernail test for checking the glaze of thickness before spraying. Do you have a go-to fingernail test as far as glaze in the bucket before it goes in the sprayer?
Yes. But it's very hard to relay.
Okay.
You know, when I dip my finger in my glaze, and by the way, I don't use specific gravity with my glazes. It's all an intuitive process. But when I dip my fingers in the glaze, I like to see a little definition where my cuticles are. But some glazes I use a little thicker, and some glazes I use a little thinner, so they're not exactly all the same.
Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
And it's some glazes I know need to be applied a little thicker. Like my ash glazes, I apply them thicker, so I spray them a little thicker when I'm spraying, so I don't end up with too watery a surface.
Cool. Okay, another lightning question. Do you have any idea how much the clay body affects the thickness? You know, the different clay bodies might have different absorption.
Uh, I can't really answer that, but I can verify that it's true.
Yeah, that
Uh,
makes sense.
the
Yeah.
different clay bodies have different absorption. I also, I raw glaze, and raw pots have less absorption, and because there's always still a little bit of moisture in the clay body, so they're less absorbent. The bisque temperature will affect the absorbency too. If you have a lower bisque, it's going to be more porous, and a higher bisque less porous. So uh, it's just intuition is the way to get there. That's all I can say.
Test, 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 right? Just give it a shot and
Yes.
see what happens. There you go. Another quick question about bentonite. Wondering if you add bentonite when you're spraying on raw pots.
I do. All my glazes have bentonite. Usually 1 to 2%, depending on how much other clays in the glaze. Um, I It helps ensure against crawling on raw glaze pots, but also it helps with suspension of the glaze.
Another quick question, if this okay, lightning round's okay. You're into this? Is this all right?
Sure.
Okay, good. Let's see. When you do your liner glaze, do you spray the glaze soon after, or do you let it dry overnight?
Well, today I let it dry overnight because I wanted to be prepared ahead of time. Um, Normally I don't. I just apply the liner. I start spraying the outside, within a few minutes of glazing, of pouring the liner in. So it's dry to the surface, but there's still moisture in the pores.
Cool. Okay. Um, do you ever run a density test? And I think when this person's asking about a density test, they're wondering about specific gravity. Do you ever measure the specific gravity of your glazes?
I do not. I tried using a hydrometer uh, many years ago, and every time I let it fell to a different depth, so I gave up. But I know you can weigh the specific gravity. I've just never done it.
Yeah, okay. I don't do it very much either. um, so I was wondering, someone actually had a quick question. Why don't you use juicy fruit as a liner, or do you secretly do that and didn't put it in the notes?
Um, it's just personal choice.
Cool.
I think juicy fruit is probably not the most uh, food safe of glazes, but it's but my rules are my rules, and we're just ready to go into personal rules. So that could be on somebody's list of personal rules.
Yeah, nice. All right, one last question before we do that, and I know that this is going to get
No,
asked.
no,
Just
no.
one last one, and it should be
Okay,
a quick
okay.
one. And I know a lot of people are going to ask. Here you go. Is it possible to use these glazes on bisque pots without adjusting the recipe?
Yes,
I love it.
yeah,
Awesome. Good. I
yeah. These glazes work equally well on bisqueware as they do on raw. And whenever I teach a totally participatory workshop, we always raw glaze, but when it's just a spraying workshop, people bring in bisqueware, and everything works just fine both ways. The 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 spray it until it wet works a little different on bisqueware because pot's not likely to look as wet. I do try to encourage people to dampen if they're glazing bisqueware, to dampen the bisqueware first with a wet sponge. That way, it more likely is going to show up as being wet on the pot as you're spraying, because it's less absorbent.
All right. Thanks for that. We'll save a couple more questions for later. So,
Okay.
yep, there you go. We're back at the outline.
Okay. We're talking about personal rules here, and the personal rules I don't really have a lot to say about, but it's something that you would derive through experimentation. Uh, Follow your own muse. Look for your own outside influences. Work with colors that inspire you, and experiment. And once you get some things figured out, then put them into a form where you can kind of repeat them and do a and get a somewhat consistent look. I think everybody's eventual goal is probably to have pots that look like you, or not that look like you, that look like that reflect your aesthetic sensibilities. And so when you're experimenting, you want to kind of move in that direction. And once you kind of get something figured out, you'll never figure it out, but once you start to feel like you're figuring something out, then make rules based on how you get there. And but then you can take that too far. So once you get to the point where you have a look that feels personal and feels satisfying to you, don't stop experimenting, because the continued experimentation is what allows for evolution. So that's the rules. So important as it is to break rules, it's then important to make your own rules so that you can have some consistency over a body of work. Okay, so one of the things that's really important to me is the development of microcrystals. Pretty good example of microcrystals here with all the kind of speckling and so forth. When I talk about being influenced by moss and lichens and tidal pools and so forth, this kind of shows that pretty well. And one of the things I like about microcrystals is if you think about moss and lichens, they're growing on a form. It could be a tree trunk, it could be a rock, could be anything if the environment is wet enough. So microcrystals grow on the pottery, so it's pretty likely that you're going to get something that looks more like it grew there than it was sprayed on with mechanical means. So that is essentially my attraction to microcrystals. It's the fact that as they develop on pots, they grow, which gives them a natural quality. SCM is, actually all matte glazes, not all, vast majority of matte glazes are microcrystalline glazes. That's where the matteness comes from. And SCM happens to be an extreme version of a matte glaze that has a microcrystalline structure. And as I explained earlier, it's a glaze that really needs modifiers over it in order to kind of blossom into something that's beautiful. So how do you get started with microcrystalline glazes when you're thinking about glazes? Well, that's a whole workshop in and of itself, except I will say that there are certain ingredients to look for in glazes that happen to be crystal formers. Titanium dioxide, which also would include rutile. Rutile has titanium and iron in it. Is one of the major crystal formers that I use in my glazes. Zinc oxide, which is the most common flux used in macrocrystalline glazes, but it also works on microcrystalline glazes, is another. Iron oxide can form pretty strong crystals in glazes also, depending on the base glaze that it's in. So that's an idea of the crystal formers I use in my glazes. But then there's another category that I consider crystal facilitators. They're not necessarily what form the crystal, but they help the titanium and zinc to do their job. And that would include like barium carbonate, strontium carbonate, lithium carbonate. I don't use barium myself, but barium is one of the best facilitators for micro crystalline glazes. Now, as far as being crystal facilitator, I think there's something more important than the actual materials we're talking about. If you know anything about glaze composition, about glaze chemistry, the glazes that are flux saturated and fairly low in alumina and low in silica tend to be really susceptible to forming crystals, microcrystals. Glazes that are high in silica and high in alumina tend to be really stable and really consistent in the way they look, where the low alumina, low silica glazes, flux saturated, tend to grow crystals much more easily. And so I'm going to stop there with that, but it can get very technical, and we don't have time to get into that much more in much deeper sense in this 2-hour workshop. So once you've got crystal formers in the glaze and the crystal facilitators in the glaze, then you need the appropriate cooling cycle in the kiln for them to develop. And for the first 38 years that I made pots, I fired in large gas reduction kilns, and I never even considered the cooling cycle, because everything cooled very slowly. They were thick brick walls built on a concrete base, where it was like a big heat sink. There were, bag walls and a lot of heavy shelves that were provided a lot of mass in the firing, and the kilns naturally cooled slowly, and it takes a slow cooling in order to develop microcrystals. But then in 2010 or 2009, I switched to electric firing and started firing small electric kilns, which have thinner walls, less mass, and they're up off the ground so that air circulates all the way around them, and everything cools very quickly. If you're firing an electric kiln that cools quickly, you need to program some kind of a cooling cycle into the it's like an add-on to the end of the firing cycle. Now, I always knew that, and when I started initially electric firing, I had just a rudimentary firing cycle or cooling cycle that went from the top temperature on down to about 1700 degrees. But then I read an article that really kind of opened my eyes in about 2010 called The Many Faces of Iron. And it's written by somebody named Dr. Carol Marians. I've never met her, but this article really transformed my thinking about cooling. And she did very scientific experiments, much more about scientific method than any of my experimentation ever is. But she had one glaze, which happened to be an iron saturate, something that was susceptible to growing crystals. And she had one different application process, one different thickness, one. Oh, okay.
What happened?
Yeah, I just like poof.
Froze.
Her scientific method kept everything constant. The glaze application, the glaze, the form it was applied to, the firing cycle, everything was the same except for cooling cycles. And she had 7 different cooling cycles that were photographed in the results were photographed in this article, and it looked like 7 different glazes. It was amazing. And by reading her article, it caused me to start experimenting with slow cooling at a much lower temperature. So my slow cooling at this point happens all between 1700 and 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. And so when I'm firing, if I'm in a hurry, sometimes I like really force cool the kiln from 2200 down to 1700 degrees. And then sometimes I even raise the lid when I do that. And
What?
I've posted some examples on Instagram, just like an inch, just a little peek in there. But I don't usually do that. But I let the kiln drop naturally from 2200 down to 17, and then I go through a 6 to 8 hour slow cooling between 17 and 1500 degrees. In the handouts, it has my most current slow cooling cycle in there, and I'm not going to go over it in detail, but know it's there if you want to use it. So microcrystals are super, super important to me. Without growing microcrystals, my pots would not look anything like they do. And so I've spent a good part of my career just kind of playing with that. And in the early part, I didn't really know what I was doing. And then I started learning more about development of crystals and started making decisions more specifically on how to make that happen. So now it's time
Wait.
to look at what?
I might have some lightning questions for you.
Okay.
Okay. So
Actually, while Tommy's asking questions, why don't you do a little survey of the pots down here?
ooh, nice. Yeah.
Because I've got them divided into categories.
Okay, cool. So,
Okay.
quick question, and I think you addressed this. Does a scut kiln or an electric kiln grow crystals differently? And I think you addressed that by saying that it was definitely different than the big reduction kiln, and that's why you put in the controlled cool, right?
Right.
Okay.
The smaller electric, and the idea is not electric versus gas. Is the electric kilns tend to be smaller kilns with less mass, and so they cool very fast, and they have thinner walls.
Nice.
So if you had an equally thick walled behemoth of an electric kiln, it would cool slowly also.
Okay. Another question was, when you're doing the rapid drop in temperature down to 1700, does this freeze the running process on the surface, and then the crystals begin to grow from there?
Well, it would definitely. It doesn't really freeze it, I don't think, but it does probably stop it from running quite so much. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. As far as I know that I think you know the end. Does thickness also affect crystal growth? Have you found that the thicker something is, the more crystals you get, or the fewer crystals?
Oh, you bet. The I I try not. I try to always keep it within a kind of fairly narrow window of thickness range, but definitely it changes. Uh, if the application's too thin, you're not going to get much at all in the way of crystal growth.
And here's a
And sometimes, actually, like where a glaze might pool in the bottom of a bowl or something, if you get too much glaze running into the center, the crystals sometimes get so dramatic that they end up looking like rocks, individual rocks in the middle of a piece. So I definitely, there is that range. Earlier, I was talking about my sprayed glaze thickness being comparable to 1 to 1.5 coats of dip glaze, and then that really comes to play here.
And it looks like some people have done a good job of finding the handout and referencing some questions. For just a few others out there, you might want to double check some of the handouts because they'd be relevant to the questions you're asking. But one question that someone found is just that your ramp up and and you have that slow cool down, but you're doing that ramp up because of it being single fired, right? You're doing slow up because it's single fired, then you're doing slow down to control that cooling, right?
Yeah, the slow up is actually when I advise people on switching from just uh, a standard firing cycle to one that includes slow cooling, uh, I don't necessarily suggest that anybody do anything different for their ramp up. I think it has very little total impact on the glaze. The only part that I feel is really important is the cool down.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In your opinion, does that window of 1700 to 1500, do you think that sweet spot would apply to cone 10 glazes as well for
Oh
crystal
yeah,
growth? Okay.
I do actually. Although, uh, you know, the I think there could be some variation, but that's a wide enough window that it kind of encompasses everything from cone 6 to cone 10.
Cool. Great. Um, I think we're caught up. So at this point, I know you're going to talk about your color palette, and then we might get to some glazing, eh?
Yep,
Nice.
yep.
Um,
We're coming right up to the color palette right now.
Good. And we're also coming to our halfway point. It's almost 1 o'clock. So just giving you a heads up, we're about halfway through.
Okay, thanks. So Mike gave you kind of an overview of the palette. We're gonna want you to kind of zero in here a little bit. And I'm gonna pick up some pots and set them here. So probably just kind of handheld following me and looking down a little bit probably is the best thing here. So I divide my work into what I consider the warm palette, and warm palette is everything that has iron related colors to it. And so this is warm palette with an amber transparent glaze, an iron fake ash. This is the warm palette with green fake ash glaze and green transparent glaze. Warm palette with blue fake ash glaze and blue transparent glaze. So that's the three different categories I have of warm palette. And then I have two categories of cool palette. The cool palette with blue fake ash and blue transparent glaze, and cool palette with green fake ash and green transparent glaze. And I'm going to pick out one of each of these pots of these categories and talk about the specific glazes I use to get those colors. So we'll start over here with this. This is SCM warm with red orange and juicy fruit over it. This is Hannah's fake ash, which is pretty subtle here, but you see how it varied. This is transparent amber down here. Frost black for the border on the foot and the border on the rim and down the handle, and red orange for the interior glaze. So I have SCM warm, which was kind of applied from about here to here, a little bit down lower too, with red orange and juicy fruit with iron over that. I have SH copper ash, which was sprayed up under the rim, and you see some distinct runs and some feathery runs. Often I'll get a combination of those two things together. Transparent green sprayed from the foot up to about here. Frost black around the foot, frost black on the rim, down the handle, and red orange on the inside. This is a part of the when you get this back as a video, you might want to watch over because it's going to go by really quick here. This is the, well, actually, this is a good thing to include here. I consider these both the same palette. This piece has SH copper ash. This piece has no ash. All the rest of the glazes were the same, but no ash on the smaller bowl here. SCM warm with red orange sprayed over it and juicy fruit with iron sprayed over it from here to here. Hannah's blue ash sprayed up on top and cascading down. Transparent blue down here and coming up where it kind of meets the matte glazes. Frost black on the rim, down the handle, and across the foot. On the cool palette, this is SCM cool, essentially throughout here, and the top. Frost green as a first modifier over that. Transparent blue as a second modifier over that, and a little bit of Hannah's blue ash. You can see some streaking here. On the shoulder of this pot, we have a predominance of transparent blue. And you can also see some crystals growing here where some of the SCM is run down and is under the transparent blue. So sometimes there's a chance for some really kind of unexpected things happening. Frost black liner, frost black border on the bottom of the piece. This bowl is frost black sprayed on the back. On the front side, I have frost black. Actually, I started out by brushing the middle of this and then ended up spraying over it. Well, one of the problems with spraying on the interior of plates and bowls is that it's very difficult to control exactly where the glaze is going. So it's more likely to spread out. So I wanted to have a little bit of delineation here. So I brushed the first layer of frost black and then just sprayed the rest of it. And you see the kind of variation here. That's where there's some slip and it pooled and it runs a little thinner on the edge of the slip. So SCM cool around the rim, frost green, transparent green sprayed on the juncture between the frost black and the SCM, and actually sprayed on fairly thick there. And then a little frost black kind of kissing the rim on this piece. This is a kind of I don't know if I'm going to be doing much with this or not, but it's a kind of a different example where I, same glazes as I just showed you, but I have frost black out on the edge here, transparent green. Actually, first of all, there was SCM cool throughout the middle here, but a predominance of transparent green over it. So you can see where as here it leads to something that's looks totally different, and so much more of the transparent green on this piece than on this piece. So it looks like two different glaze combinations totally, but it's all the same glazes.
Stephen, I have a question. Were you
Yeah.
using a kind of a like a watercolor blue green or a waterfall blue green in the past?
Yes.
And
I
you've
I I had a watercolor green and watercolor blue, and uh, they were very runny glazes, and they were also a little more prone to blistering than I wanted. So I uh, started experimenting with glazes to kind of take their place in my repertoire, and I ended up with this glaze called that I named transparent green and transparent blue and transparent amber, and they're a little more stable, a little easier to work with, and a little less runny.
That makes sense. Would that be similar to the 2D blue glaze you might have used before?
Nope, 2D blue is a whole different ball game.
Okay, okay. So you can tell we've got
I'm
people
not
here.
even going to go there.
No, okay. Fair enough. Fair
But
enough.
2D blue is kind of a magnesium matte glaze that for a while I was using as a modifier over the SCM Cool.
You know what this tells me? I mean, we've got some seriously informed people in this workshop. It's awesome. You know, the people have been kind of paying attention to, to what you've been doing for a while. So,
Yeah. Well, I've like we started out with talking about. I've taught a lot of workshops, and some people probably took workshops 20, 30 years ago that had some of the same technique with different glazes.
awesome.
So, okay, I think it's time to glaze some pots.
Rock and roll, baby. Let's do it.
Okay.
So the person you're seeing who's masked up there with a head on that is Mr. Mike Stumbris. He is helping us out today with a lot of video things. So we're happy to have him here with us.
So what to start with? Yes, my right hand man here, especially now that you're on this side. So um, I'm going to start by glazing this. Oh, we should be on this
That's right.
camera
We're
now.
following the mic.
I know, follow the mic. That's right. Okay, I'm gonna grab. I'm going to glaze this stein to look something like this stein. So it's going to be SCM Cool with frost green, uh, transparent green, copper ash, and a little frost black. So I was impressed in the early video that you couldn't hear the fan that much because it's really loud over here.
We can still hear you really well right now too. So nice.
Good. I can't hear myself. So, okay. So whenever I have a pot with a handle here, I always have to take some care to make sure that there's glaze underneath the handle. And when I'm glazing the handle just as part of the body, I start out with.
What are you guys doing over there? What is happening here?
Mike's mic stand is falling apart.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll have to figure that out.
So put a little SCM under the handle, and then I'm going to use short strokes, kind of following the lobes on this piece, spraying it until it's wet. Hope you can see that. Sometimes the video is not as clear as it could be. Next glaze, frost green, which is kind of a mossy looking glaze by itself, but plays a pretty big part in developing crystals, which kind of goes over the same area that the SCM Cool was. Next thing I'm going to spray on here is the copper ash. And the copper ash is going to be in a fairly narrow band from about this dividing point down to about here. You can kind of see the color. Now, if I want the copper ash to have some fairly long legs of streaking, I need to get it on fairly thick. Use a little transparent green here. And by the way, if anybody wasn't here for the first workshop and is wondering, you know, how's he, what are these guns? What's he doing? You probably need to watch the first video. You can still purchase it. So I'm going to put the transparent green fairly heavily on the rim of this piece. But I'm pretty much keeping it localized. I'm also running it down the handle. Oh, very important here. Transparent green. When on the cool palette, I use either transparent green or blue over the SCM to help give it that textural effect. So here I'm going to wipe the foot, not all the way clean, but I'm going to remove some of the glaze. And I'm going to apply a black border down here, and then I'm going to spray a little bit of frost black into the interior of the piece to kind of emphasize the thickness at that top edge. Frost black is not a runner, so I don't have to worry about it running off the bottom of the pot if I get it kind of thick at the base. Now, when I first pick up the pot after I've sprayed it, I need to make sure that that the surface of the glaze has gone matte. If it's still shiny, I'm likely to pull off all the layers of the glaze with my fingers. And the touch-up is pretty difficult. So you can see I've got a mess on the bottom I have to clean up. I begin by waxing all my pots. Makes the cleanup a little bit easier. But I still always have cleanup to do on the bottom of each piece.
Stephen, you're probably gonna cover this at some point, but can you kind of give us a quick walkthrough of the adjustments that you make to the guns, you know, as far as fluidity, air variation, and things like that, pressure and whatnot?
Sure. What'd you say, Mike?
You're going to talk about your deep cups today?
Yeah. So when I'm actually adjusting the gun itself, it's all by feel. This controls the amount of air pressure down here on the bottom of the handle. This controls the shape of the pattern from either a round to a fan. I always have it adjusted to the round. This controls how far the needle moves back and forth as you pull the trigger, and I always have it adjusted all the way open, so that I control the amount of glaze by just how far I pull down on the trigger. But I also went over all that on the first workshop. if you need to watch that again. Okay. So can you just get those two? They should kind of be the same, or as close to the same as is. This is the cool palette again, and this is actually, I'm going to switch back and forth. This is a warm palette, and I'm going to glaze it essentially like so. That's SCM warm with red, orange, and juicy fruit. Transparent blue. No, sorry. I don't know what I'm doing. Excuse me. Ask me a question if you got one, Tommy.
Yeah, no problem. So, I guess, you know, there when someone was just mentioning that when they bought, I think a D cup, one of the D cups for the sprayer, that it didn't come with a lot of instructions. They were this person's wondering if you can talk about maybe some of the advantages of using the D cups. Now,
yeah, they're coming up.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, good. All right, we'll get there.
That's like the next thing I'm going to cover here.
Excellent.
Okay, now we got the right. But this is again the warm palette with red, orange, and strontium crystal magic warm with red, orange, and juicy fruit with iron. And transparent green down here, red, orange interior. So since this pot has a trimmed foot, I'm going to start off with the underneath side. Pot with trimmed feet always start out upside down for me, so I can get the foot taken care of before I spray the upper part of the form. Red, orange, and this becomes my bottom border. Not a runner, it goes on pretty thick. SCM warm here. Oh, forgot I gotta get under the handle. When I spray under the handle, it's always easier to do it with the pot in my hands as opposed to sitting. Short strokes. Spray it until it's wet. Comes about 2/3 of the way down the form with SCM warm. Red, orange. This is what gives me the kind of Tuscan orange color in general. The juicy fruit with iron plays a part in that, but the red, orange is the most important. Sometimes these guns get a little clogged. And that's a simple procedure for unclogging most of the clogs that happen. This is the transparent green. Getting it pretty thick down here at the bottom, but also kind of running up the valleys of the lobes a little bit. A little juicy fruit with iron. That guy's done. No ash on that pot. I don't know that it's necessary, but you know, before and after, same colors. Okay, I'm going to do a covered jar. Didn't do one last time, but you know, I've got the liner glazes on here. I've got waxed around the lid, waxed around the seat. I'm going to spray the lid in place, and then I'll be cleaning up the overspray after I get everything glazed. So much bigger pot here. It takes a little bit more doing to get the glaze on. I'm going to show you the combination I'm using here. Different form, but essentially the same color combination. It's the cool palette with Hannah's blue, fake ash, and transparent blue. So I'm going to use the circular feathering technique on this because it's a bigger pot to cover with glaze, and I'm trying to get it on fairly evenly throughout the body here. Now I'm also going to get up here on top, kind of get up on my tiptoes. That's the SCM Cool. Frost Green is my first modifier. It's going to pretty much cover the same space. It's not a science, it's an art. So, you know, I often question myself as, did I put enough on that piece or should I put a little bit more on? That's what I was doing at the end. I was thinking, oh, it needs just a touch more. Gonna have Hannah's blue ash. It's gonna be mostly right up in here, but I'm gonna spray it thick enough so that it's gonna cascade down. Kind of thinning out as it can, you know, it's come down. It's mostly thick up here, but it's also, you know, fills in a little bit down through most of this side. Hopefully we'll get some action. A little bit here on top of the lid.
Steve, we have a question that I think could be good at this point, if you're up for it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone was wondering, or they're kind of saying that it seems as though you don't get a lot of glaze on the turntable, and if I might conjecture, that's for two reasons. One, you're kind of staying away from the surface of the banding wheel and trying to put glaze on the pot instead. But also, do you find that using more of the pinpoint as opposed to the fan helps you with that as well on that spray gun?
Well, particular pot, I haven't glazed much down here yet. There will be quite a bit of glaze on the turntable by the time I'm finished, because when I spray the border at the bottom, I'm actually aiming for the turntable so that it just kind of keeps it. There's a little ricochet effect of the glaze hitting the turntable and onto the foot. But also having the round spray pattern as opposed to the fan would also help that. It helps keep it more localized where I'm trying to put it on the pot. So this is again the transparent blue, kind of following some of these undulating lines on my pot. Fairly thick down here, fairly thin, but getting a little bit of the transparent blue up here accounts for a lot of that textural breakup. Notice how I'm getting some of these edges. I see edges turning a little bit shiny on the pots is something that I'm trying to accomplish quite a bit of the time. I'm going to come in with the frost black here, and it might look like I've glazed most of this pot, but I'll point out where the frost black is going to go. First of all, it's going to go on the foot, so I'm taking off some of the overspray from the foot down here. But also there's mostly no glaze on the handles up here and the rim. So the handles, the three handles, the rim, and the foot are all going to be frost black. One quality that I'm putting into practice here, which tends to be kind of elusive for a beginning sprayer, is the fact that I'm aiming. I'm getting mostly the spray on where it's headed, and just a minor overspray on the pot itself. And up here on the rim, and I actually want that to be fairly thick, because it's essentially the only glaze that's on the pot at that point. This is just a little more, you can kind of see the attempt to try to put a little bit of glossy at the edges here. it kind of makes the glaze break a little bit. So I came back there again with a little transparent blue. So I have to make sure this is dry. You can see one thing I really try to do when I'm making glazing lids is I try to wax them so that there's not any extra bare clay showing. That's something that I'm really becoming increasingly more picky with on my pots. I don't like that rawness of the white porcelain showing through. And this is a process that with experience you can get better. I know a beginner would be terrified to have the glaze this close on the lid, but the thing is, through experience, I understand what glazes are likely to run and what glazes aren't, and so I can keep that. Can you show that?
Did you glaze?
You can hardly see.
Did you glaze under the underside of the lid earlier, and we just didn't see it?
Well, I glazed. I put all my liner glazes on tonight, just so that's part of the liner.
Great, thanks.
Let's see here.
Awesome, thanks.
And that was poured. I did not clean the bottom of that pot off. I will do it after the fact. I'm trying to speed things up here a little bit.
Yeah, sounds good. We're inside of half an hour. We got about 25 minutes left.
Ooh.
So we'll make our typical announcement that chances are we're going to have some overage time on this. So if you guys have to leave right at 2 o'clock or right at the end of the workshop, the recording will cover that overage time.
SCM warm.
I got another question about your lidded jar. Do you fire the lid and pot together or separately?
Together. Always. I was, when I first learned pottery, a lot of things were pretty old school at that point. And back in the 70s, everybody just about fired lids in place. It's not so much the case anymore, but I still fire them in place. Okay, so that's SCM warm over the pot. You notice I didn't get any on the handle here. That's going to be black. Have some red orange for the that gives me that Tuscan orange. It's going to be the copper ash. Fairly thick up here, but I want it to kind of blend. So there's some fairly thin that comes down a ways, but the thick part is concentrated up here a little more. Transparent green. Now this is going to be no, I don't have one to show you. But that transparent green is going to be at the bottom, and it's going to be just a little bit of following the valleys up here too. So I'm gonna put just a little bit of edge treatment with the transparent green up here, just to kind of achieve a little balance from the top to the bottom. Frost black for a border at the bottom. And for a border at the top. So you can see on this piece how I'm glazing the handle to be a separate color from the body, whereas on the Stein, I glazed the handle to be the same as the body. Little juicy fruit with iron, kind of a top coat here, brings out some of the richness in that Tuscan orange color. And then a little bit more of the red orange on the inside, just to help delineate between the black rim and the red orange interior. Okay, I'm going to leave that to clean off the bottom after the workshop's over. We're running short on time here, so. Mike, at this point, we're going to go over here. We're going to jump to something a little more technical now. And, you know, the whole time I've been spraying from the 70s onward has been an evolution of understanding my equipment, just the same as it's been an evolution of understanding the aesthetics of what I'm trying to do. And one of the big discoveries I made about 5 years ago, I had a student that came to a workshop and brought this DeVilbiss decups system on a spray gun to use at the workshop. And I was just amazed by it. You know, in general, these spray guns come with cups like so that have to have an air hole in the top in order to work. And so you can't lay them down, you can't set them upside down. Notice all these spray guns are upside down in my rack. And the reason they're upside down is because it allows the glaze to drain out of the mechanism while they're sitting there. Sometimes I'll have these guns set up like this for 3 or 4 weeks at a time with only minimal amounts of clogging, because every time I quit using them, the glaze drains out of the mechanism. The reason they get away with that is because it's like an old-fashioned baby bottle. As the glaze gets used, the bag on the inside collapses, and so it doesn't need that air access hole in order to spray efficiently. So got to get my notes here so I don't forget something. When I started using the decups kit, I just couldn't believe how much better it made everything. Allows you to store the glaze upside down. The guns seem to have better atomization. The adjustments seem to work a little more finer than they do on a gun with just the standard cup. They're definitely less likely to clog, and you can keep the glaze stored for an extended period of time without water evaporating out. You can take the gun off, put a little stopper in the top, and that'll store for several months without losing too much water. Eventually, you have to clean it out, but I think they're just fabulous. I always say it's the best thing since sliced bread to discover these. They're actually meant to be disposable. They were developed for the automobile body shop industry, and these bags are meant to be disposable. You use them once, toss them out, and with the solvent-based paint, that makes more sense than it does with glaze. I use one set of these until they spring a leak, which is usually a year or more. So I can get a year or two out of the liners, and the rest of the system works with the it's meant to be used over and over for a long time. So the way that, and these come in three different sizes. This is a 9-ounce, 24-ounce, and then there's a 32-ounce. I tend to use the 9-ounce for glazes that I don't use a lot of, and the 24-ounce for glazes that I use in greater quantity. These are lighter, these are heavier. If you're if the idea of spraying kind of makes you think of shoulder problems, you're probably better off having the smaller glaze container, because it's lighter weight in the end. But if you're glazing a lot of pots, you have to fill them more often, so it's just a trade-off. But each spray gun has to have an adapter, which in the case of these large TCP global guns, it's the number 11 adapter. This is in the notes, by the way, and it just screws in place, and then this guy twists on. Of course, we picked one that doesn't work.
Of course, naturally.
Here, this works. These are in, yes, but it's just like a quarter of a turn to get that on, and then it seals, and a quarter of a turn to get it off.
That is cool, man. That is really cool.
Well, it's we could actually do a whole workshop just on using these things, but it's pretty straightforward. I've got information in my handouts. The most difficult part for this is that if you buy the 3-gun TCP Global set, there's not a decups adapter that fits on the small on the detail gun. So what you have to do, and this is also included on my handout sheet, you have to come in with an Allen wrench and this is almost impossible to get out. This is screwed in all the way, and I have to use kind of all my strength to get this, because it's not really meant to come out. But you unscrew this threaded piece that's part of the gun, and then this is a hardware store part. It's a pipe threads on one end and compression fitting on the other end, and there's actually a threads that match up. I've got the exact parts that you need to buy, and then it's a different adapter that screws on here. This is a number 26. This is a number 11. So to do this, you got to be reasonably handy, although there's nothing particularly difficult about it. But it does require a little planning ahead, and I really can't recommend these things high enough. If you're going to use gravity spray guns, I see them as a must these days. Are there any questions about
and
the cups that didn't get covered there?
I think so. So, someone says that they've got a sprayer that has like a 200 micron filter inside. You toss any of those inline filters, right? You don't even bother with those.
Oh, that's the most important thing about spray gun, is to throw that filter away. That will clog up with glaze in a heartbeat. You won't get anything through the gun. When you first buy the guns, they're stuck down in here, and just pull that out and do not pass go. Just throw it away.
Well, when it comes to the small detail gun, do you ever? It looks like you went through the hassle of kind of fixing it up. Do you use it very often, and what do you use it for?
The thing about the detail gun is they have a narrower pattern, so you can be a little more precise with them. It's not like an airbrush, but it doesn't fan out as much as the full size gun. So what I recommend is this TCP Global set with 3 guns, and you get 1 detail gun and 2 full size guns with the set. You essentially get 3 guns for the price of 2.
Nice.
And
okay.
And not everybody would have a use for the detail guns, and if you don't, you might just want to bypass that set. And but if you do imagine that you want to be a little more precise with some of the spraying, it's good to have some ability with the detail guns.
A quick follow-up question to the detail gun. As far as the adapter, is that the number 26 or the number 23? And is that in the handout as well?
It's 26. Yeah, it's in the handout. It's number 26.
Awesome. Thank you.
And the number 26 adapters are harder to find. And the last couple of times I've bought them, I've just searched for them on the internet with Google search, or I've also bought them off of eBay that way. The number 11s are quite common. The number 26 are harder to find.
Someone makes mention that the detail guns start to leak after a month or 2. Do you have any experience with that? Does that happen to you too?
Well, the problem with spray guns and glazes is that they're at their absolute best as you're unwrapping the new package, and it's all downhill from there. And yes, the detail guns wear out faster than the full size guns. I've had detail guns that started giving me problems in a month, but I've had full size guns that I've used for 2 or 3 years without any maintenance. And so yeah, the detail guns are a little more problematic, but with TCP Global, you can buy the replacement parts for them if you want to rebuild them, the O-rings and the springs and all that stuff.
Great.
Whereas with Harbor Freight, you just have to throw them away when they don't work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you? There's someone who's asking, and I don't actually know what this means. Does he make a distinction between 1.8 and 1.7 millimeters? Does
Nah.
that ring a bell to you?
Yeah, that's the size of the orifice on the fluid tip. You can get needles and fluid caps that are all the way from 2.5 down to 1.0, and that's millimeters. And for glazes, anything in the 1 to 2 range works fine. You just have to know that the larger that number, the more volume of material goes through and the wider the spray pattern is. Smaller the number, the less volume, and the more likely they are to get clogged up, and also their narrower spray pattern.
Yeah, that
My
makes sense.
favorite size is 1.3.
Ooh, 1.3.
And you can adapt like if you have a kit that has it's a 1.8, a 1.4, and a 1.0, you can adapt them for 1.3, but you end up spending a bunch of money if you do that. If you're picky about the orifice size, you need to buy the guns that already have that orifice size.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If the gun ever drips, do you change out the needle? Do you replace it? I guess it depends on the gun you're using, whether it's a cheap gun or a TCP gun, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's just a myriad of problems that happen. One of the things I said last time we did this is that if you spray and you like the results and you're excited about it, it's worth pursuing. If it seems kind of equal to dipping and pouring for you, don't go into spraying.
Yeah.
You have to really want to spray in order to do it. And there's, it helps to be a little bit of a do-it-yourself person to maintain guns.
Makes sense. That really does. So we're, technically speaking, we have 6 minutes left. and like I said, I know we may go over, but I know there was something you wanted to talk about, Stephen, which was maybe talking about kiln paper, protecting kiln shelves, talking about cleaning up the bottoms of your pieces. And this might be a good time to head in that direction if that works for you.
Okay. We are going in that direction. A couple years ago, I went to NSECA and I bought a pot of, I can't think of the guy's name. Too bad. I won't be able to give him a plug, but it was actually a stoneware cup to drink out of, and the bottom of it was polished. It was polished like a stone countertop in somebody's kitchen, and I was so intrigued by that. I've always sanded the bottoms of my pots, but I went back to research how this was done, and so I buy this stuff from Diamond Core Tools. They're at diamondcoretools.com, and I have rigid sanding discs. Eric Botbull was the
nice.
the guy that I
there
bought
it is. All right.
the cup from. So you changed my life, Eric. But anyway, this is a 240 mesh diamond grinding pad that is glued to a bat, goes on the wheel. And one of the real advantages to the one that goes on the wheel is that, a lot of times pots come out of the kiln just slightly uneven on the bottom with maybe a little rock to them. You can smooth off anything and give it a rock solid stance on the table so there's no rocking. And if you have something with a small base, that can be really important to make it more stable. But also, these work great for glaze drips. As you can see here, sometimes my glazes run quite a bit, and sometimes they run off the pots. And so I I have, you know, I carefully kind of angle and do this. I would hope for one to demonstrate with where I could actually um, grind a drip off, but I had already done all that, so I didn't have any examples. But I very carefully, you know, tilt this up and kind of do it on the edge, and I get I can do almost a seamless job of grinding most glaze drips that way. And then after I do that, so that gives me the basic flatness of the bottom, and gives me the but then I have these, again, from Diamond Core Tools. These are flexible diamond pads. I've got a 240, a 400, and an 800 grit. And I start out with the 240. Just go full speed ahead. You have to make sure it's stable with the Giffen grip. And then to the 400. And by the way, anytime you use diamond grinding tools, you need to use water. And you need to use enough water so that you wash away any loose diamonds, because if you get loose diamonds, they will dull the pads. But if you use enough water, you can counteract that, and they actually last quite a long time. So, you know, I don't actually polish the bottom of my pots, but I get them to the point where there's kind of like a baby's bottom. I've had some grandkids in my life recently, and that baby's bottom feels really good. So there's nothing like a pot where you pick it up and you're surprised with how smooth the bottom of the pot is. So it's something I really value. And thanks to Diamond Core Tools for their popularizing of diamond grinding stuff. It's really great stuff. So,
quick follow-up.
Okay.
As far as drips,
I
right?
need,
Can I hop in
I
about
need my
drips?
notes here. Yeah.
Okay. The ceramic fiber paper.
Yes.
What's
thank
up
you.
with that?
Everybody knows what Kailwool is. Ceramic fiber paper is Kailwool. It's compressed into a sheet that can be cut with scissors, and it's like kind of like felt. And I forgot to get some out. I would show it to you, but it's like kind of a thick felt, and you can cut it to the size of the bottom of your pots, and it can be glued to the bottom of the pots in a firing. And if you get a glaze drip, unless it's a flood of glaze, it's enough to usually keep it. Oh, thank you, Alice. These are a couple of used pieces. They get brittle after a firing, but pots have been fired on these, and they can be reused if you're careful, if they don't have a glaze drip. But you can see this is 3 millimeters thick, and the source that I use for these is also on the handouts. It's a company called Skyline Components, and people that fuse glass use this stuff, but they tend to buy it in small sheets, and this stuff comes in a big roll, and it's like $150 for a big roll, but it'll last most single potters probably the rest of their life. And I use this at workshops a lot. On my own work, I only use it when I think I'm firing a risky piece. But I also use advancer shelves in my electric kiln. Those thin, really expensive silicon carbide shelves the glaze doesn't stick to. I kiln wash them, and most of my glaze drips just lift up off of those. So you don't. Then it makes the glaze drip a lot easier to grind without marring the bottom of the pot.
Yeah, and when you're gluing those into place, are you using like cheap Elmer's glue or wood glue or
Yeah.
what?
Yeah, just Elmer's is all you need. Just like kind of, people are used to gluing wads for wood firing and soda firing.
Yeah.
Same principle, except it's just a flat piece to the bottom of the pot. And know that you can kind of see this, how this is curled up at the edge. If you're not careful, this will sometimes curl up and get in the glaze at the bottom of your pot. So you need to be very, very cautious not to have a lot of extra of the paper sticking out beyond the pot. But if you try this, you'll learn how to use it. I think it's a better choice than cookies, clay cookies under the bottom of a pot, because if you weld a clay cookie in place, it's there forever. If you get a glaze drip on this, just a Scotch-Brite pad will make this turn to dust, and you can, then all you have left is the glaze drip and not the cookie welded to the bottom of the pot.
Awesome. Okay, we're gonna, in case you got a couple other questions out there, we're gonna
wait a minute.
Look at.
I have to make sure there's nothing.
Yeah.
I know there's at least one thing I want to say here. Okay. Even Dremel tool bits, 48 of them for $20.
That's with Harbor Freight, you said, right?
Harbor Freight. Yeah, I've pretty much sworn off of Harbor Freight for most stuff, but those diamond rotary tool bits are a great deal.
I will second that. Those things are awesome, especially for the price.
Yeah, and one of the things that some of you might feel right now is like, holy shit, there was just too much information and went by too fast, and I wish you would have expounded on this longer. Something I offer as an ongoing service is to do FaceTime calls with potters. A FaceTime call can be set up to ask questions, can be set up to explain details about something like spraying. It can be for a critique. It can be for whatever you need, or it can be a combination of all of those things. And they're hour-long sessions, and I charge $80, but it's an hour and sometimes an hour plus that you get to ask me as many questions as you can possibly ask. So if you still have some questions about spraying and you just want to be a little more informed about it, consider setting one of those sessions up.
That's awesome. And what would be the best way for people to reach you if they wanted to set that up?
Email. I always get people sending me messages on Instagram and Facebook, and I often miss those. So email, it's sahill@me.com. It's all over my handouts.
Awesome. That's great. That's really great. Let's see. There's one more question just about the paper. Have you ever tried using a rigidizer on the fiber paper to get longer life out of the paper, or are you kind of cool with the life you get as it is?
I've never heard of a rigidizer. I don't know what that is.
Okay.
Whoever is asking that question, you might send me an email telling me about the rigidizer. Seriously,
yeah, it sounds like they could be a good source for you.
Yeah, I can imagine it's something that makes it stiff and makes it less ready to disintegrate when you take it off the bottom of a pot. But I'm not familiar with that. I learn a lot from my students every time I teach a workshop. It's kind of students in person because it keeps a lot of the back and forth from happening. But I'm happy to answer some more questions at this point.
Great. Yeah, we actually do have one, and I'll just kind of read it to you. So with the disposable cup system, you do not use the filter disc, and it comes with multiple hard cups as well as disposable liners, ?
I don't use what?
I guess there's a filter disc that might come with the cup system. You don't use. I'm not sure what that's referring to as far as the filter disc.
No, it's. I'm not sure I remember about a filter disc, but it's not something that anything that's a filter that goes in the spray gun is probably not advisable. And with the cup system, you can buy this is and it's not called a frame, but it's called something like that. They come in packages of 2. The liners come in packages of like 30. And that includes the rubber stopper, and then the adapters are sold separately. So those 3 different things need to go into the purchase of the decups if you're going to use them for your spray guns. And I tend to buy things in mass because I spray all the time and I take them to workshops and I go through a lot more stuff than I would if I was just working by myself.
Cool. I got a question about firing schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little more about the firing schedule for Cone 6. The question is, you have it in your schedule that you go to 2200 as the peak, but then you hold it for an hour. So you're basically doing an hour's worth of heat work to get that from 2200 up to Cone 8. Is that right?
Correct. And the thing about electric kilns is the weak part in the whole system is the thermocouple. Thermocouples are not very accurate, and so every electric kiln is going to be a little different in the way and the peak temperature that it fires to. And so I always recommend putting guide cones in a kiln, even if you're not going to watch them while the firing is proceeding. You can check them after the firing's unloaded, so you know how hot you actually got. So cones rule when it comes to gauging the peak temperature that you fire to. But cone 6 is 2232 according to the Orton charts, and I fired at 2200 with an hour hold, and that in almost all kilns I fire gets cone 8 at least part way down. So I either fire to somewhere between a cool 8 and a hot 8. Occasionally cone 9 goes down. I'm a lot of time firing in new situations with new kilns at workshops, and I never know exactly how hot it's going to fire, but I always get in the ballpark. And one of the things about my glazes, these glazes do pretty well all the way from cone 6 to at least cone 9, and as long as you're careful about thickness, probably cone 10. But you need, the hotter you get, the more careful you need to be about running.
Yeah, that makes a lot
But
of
they
sense.
all have a pretty long firing range.
That's nice. Versatile that way, right?
I'm sorry?
It's they're more versatile that way.
I guess you could say that. You could also say the more problematic they are.
Okay.
The thing about my glazes, and this is probably something I should have talked about more extensively. I never expect very specific results. Everything that I do has a kind of an acceptable range that it falls in. That is, it's not narrow, it's broad, and you get outside of that range and they don't work. But if you're going to use microcrystalline glazes and you're going to use multiple layers on pots, you need to be kind of ready to accept a fairly wide potential outcome. Some pots might look a little underglazed, some might look a little overglazed, but after you make 100 pots, you put them all together and it's a nice variety. What you unload a kiln and you think, well, that's too much glaze or not enough. but then by the time it gets mixed in with all the rest of the pots you make, it adds to the variety and the interest, really. But if you expect very specific results, this is not for you, because it's very difficult to create with any kind of a specificity as to how the outcome is going to be. I like not being in total control. I like being able to open a kiln and be surprised. I don't really want to know everything ahead of time. I don't want to know exactly how my pots are going to look. And then sometimes I'm surprised because they turned out better than I anticipated. Sometimes I'm disappointed. But overall, the scale tips just in favor of the positive side of it, as opposed to the negative outcome.
Nice. All right, we have a couple more questions here. Someone's
Okay.
asking about the advantage of firing to cone 8 versus cone 6. They're wondering if you get more richness and color going to 8 versus 6?
Slightly. I'll tell you what inspired me is I really hate cone 6 clay bodies. They often have nepheline cyanide in them, which makes them a little flabby in the throwing process. And I like one of the most important part of any clay body to me is the plasticity of it. And so I much prefer cone 8 to 10 clay bodies. And I one day realized after I'd been firing my cone 8 to 10 clay body at cone 6 for a couple of years, I realized that they weren't as strong as I thought. And so that inspired me to fire hotter. So I just kind of hit on 8 as a compromise between 6 and 10.
Nice.
And I the clay which I use for the most part is standard 257 English porcelain, and it's officially rated at cone 8 to 10. And at cone 8 it seems nice and strong. It's certainly not translucent at cone 8.
Sure, that makes sense.
But it seems durable.
Do you ever refire a pot? You know, it doesn't turn out the way you want. Do you spray a little more glaze on, stick it back in the kiln?
I do. Probably, I would guess somewhere on the order of 5 to 10% of my pots. On a bad firing, I might have to refire a whole kiln load, and then I might do some firings that I don't have to refire anything. But when pots come out of the kiln disappointing for me, they can either be underdone or overdone. So I didn't get enough glaze on, or I got too much glaze on, or too much running or too little movement. And so if I've already got too much happening, they're not a candidate for refiring. But if they're just a little dull in their appearance, a little less movement than I'd hoped for, sometimes reapplying glaze and firing again is the best trick.
Do you do
and
anything?
actually some of my best pots have been refired.
Oh, nice. Do you do anything?
But some of my worst pots have been refired too.
Okay, fair enough. Do you do an additive or anything like that to get them to stick to the pot, the glaze, when when you've got that vitrified pot? How do you get that secondary glaze to stick on there before refiring?
Well, sometimes I just use patience. If I just need a touch of glaze, I usually don't do anything. If I need a little bit extra on there, more than a touch, I'll wet the pots, put them in the microwave, and assuming they fit in the microwave, and give it a minute or two of heat, and it will come out of the microwave hot to the touch, and then I'll glaze them immediately. And just that heat causes the evaporation. I know people that do other things. They'll put additives in the glaze, or they'll maybe spray a little starch on their pots to give the glaze something to stick to. But the only thing I ever use is a little bit of heat.
Nice. Okay, and then the infamous question: what size kiln do you put all these pots into? Oh yeah, I got you.
I actually have a gigantic stein, which some of you have seen on Instagram, that I'm getting ready to fire, and that's going to be fired in a one of the 12 cubic foot electric kilns here at the studio. But I fire most of my work in a Scott 818, and that's 18 inches wide by 18 inches tall. I have 4 advancer shelves that go in it, so I could fire 4 plates at once. I could fire a melon pitcher and probably 20 mugs at once. But I when I'm firing and I'm in a work cycle, I fire a lot. I'll fire every other day for sometimes 3 weeks. And the thing that I love about that is that when I'm experimenting, I can like try something and immediately I see if it works and I can try it again. And so you can run through a series of experiments very quickly. I can't even imagine a large onigami kiln that you fire once or twice a year. I mean, that would be, the follow through would be so small compared to the amount that I go through. So I actually love firing a small kiln, although I'm about ready to get I think it's 1022. It's got 1022, which is a little
those are
wider, a
nice.
little taller.
Yeah, those. I feel like those are really great workhorses, for those smaller batches of work too.
Yeah, I really, firing a small kiln makes me feel like I'm driving a sports car.
Ooh,
Firing a big kiln makes me feel like I'm driving a truck.
or like a Winnebago.
Yeah, and I like that nimbleness that I get from firing small kilns.
Well, Stephen, this is awesome, man. I feel like we're here at the end, and we don't have a bunch of questions pouring in, so I feel like we've been able to satisfy a lot of what people were looking for. So, thanks so much for being so thorough today.
Well, thank you, Tommy, and thanks to Mike for helping out with the camera, and and thanks for everybody signing up. Within reasonable limits, I answer emails, and like I said, if you want to go more in depth on any topic that I have some knowledge about, sign up for an hour session, and we'll go there.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, again, you want to email Stephen about setting that up. So that is sahill@me.com. So shoot him a message as far as setting up some of those private conversations. Again, I want to thank you again, Stephen. Really fantastic. Thank you, Mike Stumbers, for all your help with the videos there. I want to also say thanks to 323 Clay, who helped us out, by offering up the space where Stephen works so that we could do the recording. So this is awesome. Thanks again, Stephen. Really fantastic. Loved it. And we'll just see everybody next time.
Okay. Thanks, Tommy.